Clara stared out the massive glass windows of her penthouse, a breathtaking view of the city lights sprawling beneath her. The reflection staring back at her wasn't the confident, accomplished woman the world believed her to be. It was a shadow of someone desperately searching for meaning. Her life was filled with everything money could buy: luxurious designer dresses, lavish galas, and a stream of carefully curated acquaintances who spoke in polished words but carried hollow intentions. Yet none of it filled the gnawing emptiness that settled in her chest like a storm cloud refusing to clear. That evening, the air buzzed with anticipation as she attended an exclusive charity event at one of the city's most opulent hotels. Guests floated around the grand ballroom, exchanging polite laughter and strategic pleasantries, their lives tethered to the pursuit of wealth and reputation. Clara moved through the crowd with practiced grace, but her heart wasn't in it. Something felt off, as if the glittering world she had built was suddenly fragile, like glass on the edge of shattering. As she reached the edge of the room, her eyes caught on a man weaving through the crowd. Unlike everyone else in tailored suits and sparkling gowns, his presence was understated. Miguel. He moved with a quiet confidence, wearing the uniform of the waitstaff, a simple white shirt, black tie, and a vest that looked slightly worn. His hands were steady as he balanced a tray of champagne flutes, but it was his eyes, kind, piercing, and oddly at peace, that held her attention. Their encounter was almost accidental. Clara stepped back to avoid an overzealous guest and collided softly with him. The clinking of glasses halted, but Miguel caught the tray before any spilled. "I'm so sorry," Clara said, her voice tinged with genuine embarrassment. "No harm done," Miguel replied, his voice calm and grounded, in stark contrast to the cacophony of the room. He didn't flinch under her gaze, treating her not as the millionaire heiress she was, but as an ordinary person. The brief interaction left an impression Clara couldn't shake. Over the next hour, her eyes found him again and again, always moving through the crowd like a quiet observer of a world he didn't truly belong to. She couldn't help but wonder, have you ever met someone who made you question everything you thought you knew? If you're curious about where this story will go, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more twists and emotional turns. By the time Clara gathered the courage to speak to him again, the event was winding down, and he was nowhere to be seen. Later that night, Clara sat alone in her bedroom, the silence of the penthouse pressing against her. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of curiosity about someone outside her circle. Miguel seemed untouched by the world of excessive wealth and intricate games of influence that defined her existence. A man who likely had none of her privileges, but carried an air of authenticity that intrigued her. As she lay awake, her mind wandered back to his eyes, steady and sincere, as if they saw the world in a way she had long forgotten. For the first time in years, Clara wondered, what would it feel like to live a life unburdened by the weight of finances, yet filled with meaning? The sound of children's laughter echoed through the park as Clara sat on a weathered bench, watching the golden afternoon sun filter through the trees. She was lost in thought, replaying fragments of the night at the gala where she had met Miguel. There was a peculiar simplicity in the way he carried himself, a quiet strength that stayed with her, lingering like the faint aroma of something familiar, yet unexplored. Her gaze wandered across the park until it stopped on a figure sitting on the grass, leaning against a tree, engrossed in a book. It was him, Miguel. His posture was relaxed, his shoulders framed by the soft rays of sunlight, as if the world around him held no weight. Clara hesitated, debating whether to approach him or let the moment pass. Her life had taught her that curiosity often came with a price, yet something about Miguel made her willing to take the risk. She rose from the bench, adjusting her scarf as a nervous habit, and walked toward him. The sound of her heels crunching on the gravel drew his attention. When he looked up, his expression shifted from surprise to recognition, followed by a smile that was both warm and restrained. "Clara, right?" he said, closing his book and sitting up straighter. "From the event?" "Yes, I didn't expect to see you here," she replied, slightly embarrassed by how transparent her interest might seem. She gestured to the book. "What are you reading?" Miguel glanced down at the worn cover in his hands. "Something that helps me dream beyond the limits of finances," he said with a faint chuckle. "Though I'm not sure it's your kind of reading." "Why wouldn't it be?" Clara countered, intrigued by the subtle challenge in his tone. "Well, people like you don't usually have to dream about a different life," he said, his words careful but pointed. For a moment, Clara felt exposed. The life Miguel imagined for her was far from the reality she lived, filled with hollow extravagance and carefully masked loneliness. She sat down beside him, uninvited but welcomed by his open demeanor. "Maybe we all dream of different lives," she said softly, surprising herself with the honesty in her words. Their conversation unfolded naturally, as if they had known each other far longer than a few fleeting moments. Miguel spoke about his siblings, the struggles of keeping them together after losing their parents, and how he worked every job he could to provide for them. There was no trace of bitterness in his voice, only determination. Clara found herself listening intently, captivated by his resilience and depth. In turn, she spoke of her ventures, omitting the scale of her wealth, and how she often felt trapped by expectations she had never chosen for herself. It was the first time in years she felt understood by someone who didn't view her through the lens of money. Miguel didn't interrupt or judge. He simply listened, his gaze steady and sincere. As the sun began to set, painting the park in hues of amber and gold, Clara realized how much time had passed. She stood reluctantly, brushing imaginary dust off her coat. "Thank you for the conversation, Miguel. It's rare for me to meet someone who just listens." Miguel smiled, rising as well. "Sometimes all someone needs is to be heard. And sometimes it's enough just to hear them." Clara left the park that evening with a strange sense of clarity. She had spent countless hours and untold sums of money trying to fill the void inside her, yet a simple conversation with a man who had nothing but his integrity had done what nothing else could. As she walked back to her car, a flicker of doubt crept in. She had told Miguel only fragments of her truth, leaving out the wealth and influence that defined her life. But something told her that his perception of her, untainted by the shadow of money, was worth protecting, even if it meant keeping secrets for now. Behind her, Miguel watched her retreating figure, his thoughts conflicted. Clara was unlike anyone he had ever met, elegant yet unassuming, a paradox he couldn't quite decipher. He wondered if their paths would cross again, or if she was simply a fleeting moment of serendipity in his otherwise structured world. And as the evening deepened, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that meeting Miguel had set something in motion she couldn't yet define. A shift in her world, as subtle as the falling of a single autumn leaf, yet as transformative as the change of seasons. Clara adjusted her sunglasses as she stepped out of her car, the soft click of her heels echoing against the cobblestone streets of the city market. It was a world away from the exclusive boutiques she frequented. Here, the scent of fresh bread mingled with the earthy aroma of spices, and vendors called out their deals with voices as warm as the sunshine. She had told herself she was here to explore something new, but deep down, she knew the truth. She hoped to see Miguel. As she wove through the bustling crowd, her heart leaped when she spotted him. Miguel was by a fruit stall, carefully inspecting a basket of oranges, his expression focused and unhurried. He wore the same calm confidence she had seen at the gala and in the park, a stark contrast to the hurried chaos around him. It was as though he carried his own sense of time. Clara hesitated for a moment before making her way toward him. "We meet again," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. Miguel looked up, surprised, but his smile was genuine. "Clara, what brings you to this part of town?" "Curiosity," she replied lightly. "I've heard this market has some of the best produce in the city." Miguel raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "I didn't take you for someone who frequents markets." Clara shrugged, feeling slightly exposed under his discerning gaze. "Maybe I'm trying something new." They walked together, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Miguel shared stories about his childhood, how he and his siblings used to help their mother cook meals with ingredients she carefully chose from markets like this one. His voice softened as he spoke of those memories, and Clara found herself wishing she had stories like his, ones that weren't tied to luxury, but to love and resilience. Clara, in turn, described her own attempts at finding purpose in a life dominated by wealth. She spoke of her ventures into philanthropy and the frustration of feeling that her contributions, though significant in terms of finances, often felt impersonal and detached. "It's strange," she admitted, "how money can solve so many problems, but still leave you feeling so powerless." Miguel paused, considering her words. "Money has its place," he said thoughtfully, "but it doesn't create meaning. That comes from what we do with the time we have, not the money we spend." His words struck a chord with Clara, echoing the doubts she often buried beneath her polished exterior. She admired the way he spoke, not as someone bitter about his circumstances, but as someone who had learned to navigate life with grace, despite its challenges. As they reached the edge of the market, Miguel stopped by a small food cart selling freshly grilled corn. He handed the vendor a few coins and offered Clara one of the steaming cobs. She hesitated, glancing at the charred kernels and the thin paper napkin wrapped around the stick. "I don't think I've ever tried this," she admitted. Miguel laughed, his voice rich and unguarded. "First time for everything." She took a bite, surprised by the smoky sweetness. It wasn't the delicacy she was accustomed to, but there was something refreshingly honest about it. As they stood there, eating and laughing, Clara felt a fleeting sense of freedom, as though she had stepped out of the gilded cage her life had become. But even as she enjoyed the moment, a part of her remained on edge. Miguel didn't know the full truth about her, about the life she led, the wealth she carried as both a privilege and a burden. And with each passing interaction, it became harder to imagine revealing it to him. Would he see her differently? Would the authenticity she so cherished in him vanish under the weight of her secret? As they parted ways, Miguel glanced at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're full of surprises, Clara," he said. "I look forward to seeing what you'll try next." She smiled, but the words lingered, both a promise and a challenge. As she drove back to her world of high-rise buildings and boardrooms, Clara realized that she wasn't just exploring Miguel's world, she was beginning to question her own. And with every step she took toward him, she felt the ground beneath her shift, as though her carefully constructed life was starting to crack. The faint glow of the streetlights illuminated the small cafe where Clara sat, a cappuccino growing cold in front of her. She had come here on a whim, drawn to the cozy charm of the place Miguel had mentioned during one of their conversations. It wasn't the type of establishment she typically frequented. There were no polished counters, no extravagantly priced pastries, just the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the quiet hum of conversation. It felt grounded, real, and far removed from the world of excess she had grown up in. Miguel arrived a few minutes later, his presence as unassuming as always. He carried a notebook tucked under his arm, its edges worn, the pages peeking out in uneven layers. "Sorry I'm late," he said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Had to finish up some work." Clara smiled. "No problem. I was just enjoying the atmosphere." Miguel glanced around, his expression softening. "It's a good place, isn't it? Feels like time slows down here." They ordered their drinks, and Clara couldn't help but notice how comfortable Miguel seemed in the simplicity of the setting. He belonged to a world where every moment was savored, not rushed or consumed by the constant churn of ambition. It was a stark contrast to her own life, where even leisure felt like a performance. As they talked, Miguel opened up more than he ever had before. He spoke about his parents, who had worked tirelessly to provide for him and his siblings. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a seamstress. Together, they had taught him the value of hard work and the importance of family. But when they passed away in an accident, everything changed. "I was 17, Miguel said, his voice steady but laced with pain. "My younger sister Anna was only 8. Overnight, I had to become the adult. I quit school, took any job I could find. At first, it felt like survival, but over time it became life." Clara listened intently, her heart aching for the boy he had been and the man he had become. Miguel spoke without bitterness, as though he had long since made peace with the sacrifices he had to make. Yet Clara could see the weight he carried, etched in the lines of his face, and the quiet resolve in his voice. "I've always believed that money doesn't define us," Miguel continued, his gaze steady. "But sometimes, not having it forces you to make choices you never thought you'd face. It teaches you what really matters: family, integrity, staying true to yourself." Clara felt a lump in her throat as his words settled over her. For all her wealth, she had never faced the kind of hardship Miguel had endured. Yet, his life seemed richer in meaning, his sense of purpose unshaken by the ups and downs of finances. She wondered if her own life, with all its privilege, had robbed her of something deeper, something she couldn't even name. When the conversation turned to her, Clara hesitated. She wanted to share her truth with Miguel, to tell him about the gilded life she lived and the emptiness that often accompanied it. But the fear of shattering his perception of her held her back. Instead, she spoke in generalities, hinting at the pressures of her world without revealing its full scope. "You seem like someone who could change that," Miguel said, his tone thoughtful. "Someone who could do a lot of good." Clara looked at him, startled by his sincerity. "Maybe," she said quietly, "but sometimes I feel like I'm trapped in a cycle I don't know how to break." Miguel's expression softened. "We all feel like that sometimes. The key is finding something, or someone, that makes it worth breaking out of." His words lingered in Clara's mind long after they parted ways that evening. As she walked through the quiet streets back to her car, she couldn't shake the feeling that Miguel saw a version of her she wasn't sure she could live up to. He saw potential, purpose, and a strength she didn't yet believe she possessed. And as she sat in the silence of her car, staring at the city skyline, Clara felt the weight of her secret pressing against her chest. She knew that eventually she would have to tell Miguel the truth about who she was and the life she led. But for now, she held on to the fragile connection they had built, afraid of what might happen if it broke. The gentle hum of chatter echoed through the gallery as Clara wandered between the towering canvases and sculpted installations. The evening's event was yet another curated showcase of wealth, where the art on display seemed secondary to the glittering crowd that floated around her. It was her world, a maze of luxury and influence. But tonight, it felt more suffocating than ever. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying fragments of her recent conversations with Miguel, his words clinging to her thoughts like a melody she couldn't shake. Across the room, Lucas made his entrance, his presence magnetic in the way only the truly wealthy could command. A long-time suitor and heir to an oil fortune, Lucas had pursued Clara for years with a persistence she found exhausting. Tonight, however, his usual charm carried an edge, his smiles laced with something sharper. "Clara," Lucas called, closing the distance between them in a few strides. "You're hard to pin down these days. Where have you been hiding?" Clara forced a smile. "I've been busy." Lucas chuckled, but his eyes narrowed. "Busy or distracted?" He leaned in slightly, his tone dropping just enough to hint at something more. "Word is, you've been spending time with someone unconventional." Her stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "I wasn't aware my time required an explanation." "Of course not," Lucas said smoothly, though his smirk betrayed his annoyance. "But people talk, and when they do, they wonder how a man like Miguel fits into the life of someone like you." The name hung between them like a challenge. Clara's heart pounded, a mixture of fear and defiance surging through her. "Whatever I do or whoever I see is none of their concern. Or yours." Lucas laughed softly, shaking his head. "Oh, Clara, you're too smart not to understand how perception works. A woman like you can't afford distractions, especially not ones that come from a different world." Clara turned on her heel, leaving Lucas behind without another word. Her pulse raced as she made her way outside, the cool night air offering little relief. She had always known her relationship with Miguel, whatever it was becoming, would raise questions. But hearing his name spoken in that dismissive, calculating tone made her feel protective in a way she hadn't expected. Later that week, Clara met Miguel in the park, where they had first truly connected. He greeted her with his usual warmth, but as they walked, she sensed a tension beneath his calm exterior. Eventually he stopped, turning to face her. "Is there something you're not telling me?" Miguel asked, his voice steady, but his eyes searching hers. Clara froze, caught off guard by his directness. "What do you mean?" Miguel hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "You've always been vague about your life, and lately I've been hearing things that don't quite add up." Her chest tightened as the weight of her secret threatened to crush her. "Miguel, I'm not asking for every detail," he interrupted gently. "I just want to know if I'm getting the real you, or if there's a version of your life you think I can't handle." His words hit her like a blow, not because they were harsh, but because they were true. Clara wanted desperately to tell him everything, to strip away the facade and let him see her for who she truly was. But the fear of losing him, of shattering the fragile bond they had built, held her back. "I'm sorry if I've made you feel like I'm hiding something," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "There are parts of my life that are complicated. But I promise, Miguel, what you see with me, what we have, it's real." Miguel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded, though the tension in his jaw remained. "I'll take your word for it. For now." As they continued walking, an uneasy silence settled between them, a stark contrast to the ease they usually shared. Clara knew the moment of reckoning was approaching, and the truth she had so carefully concealed would soon come to light. That night, as she lay awake in her penthouse, Clara felt the walls of her carefully constructed life closing in. Miguel's quiet strength, his unwavering authenticity, had become her anchor. But how much longer could she expect him to stay tethered to someone who wasn't fully honest with him? And as the city lights twinkled outside her window, Clara couldn't escape the feeling that her world, her two worlds, were on the brink of collision, with Miguel caught squarely in the fallout. The storm arrived without warning, the sky over the city a canvas of ominous grey, as Clara stared out from the floor-to-ceiling windows of her office. She had retreated there after another sleepless night, the weight of her secret growing heavier with each passing day. Her phone buzzed beside her, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was an email from her father's lawyer, a routine update on the family's business holdings. Clara skimmed the document out of habit until a single name stood out, igniting a cold dread in her chest: Miguel Santos. It was buried deep in the details of an acquisition, a small note about a failed business tied to his family years ago. Her mind raced as she pieced together fragments of conversations, the struggles Miguel had shared about his parents, and the loss of their livelihoods. The truth hit her like a thunderclap. Her family's wealth, the empire she had been born into, had played a part in Miguel's downfall. Her heart pounded as she scrolled through the document again, desperately seeking an explanation that didn't confirm her worst fear. But the numbers didn't lie. The acquisitions, the closures, they lined up too perfectly with Miguel's timeline. Clara sank into her chair, the enormity of the revelation threatening to consume her. She spent the next few hours poring over old records, tracing the connections between her family's decisions and the ripple effects they had on countless lives. Miguel's was just one of many, but to Clara, it was the only one that mattered. The wealth that had insulated her from the harsh realities of the world had come at a price, one that others had been forced to pay. By the time she left her office, the storm had turned the streets into a chaotic maze of puddles and flashing headlights. Clara drove aimlessly, her thoughts a tangle of guilt and indecision. She wanted to tell Miguel the truth, but how could she expect him to forgive something so deeply tied to his pain? How could she expect him to see her the same way once he knew? Hours later, Clara found herself standing in front of Miguel's modest apartment building, her fingers hovering over the doorbell. The warmth of the light spilling from the windows above felt impossibly far from the chill of the rain-soaked night. She pressed the button before she could second-guess herself, the sound of it echoing in the quiet street. Miguel opened the door, his expression softening when he saw her. "Clara, what are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," she said, her voice unsteady. Can I come in?" Miguel stepped aside, his concern evident as he ushered her into the small but welcoming space. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, a stark contrast to the turmoil inside her. She stood in the middle of the living room, unsure where to begin. "I found something," Clara said finally, her words trembling. "Something about my family. About your family." Miguel frowned, his posture tensing. "What do you mean?" Clara took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat. "Years ago, my father's company acquired a small business. It was failing, and the acquisition ended up forcing it to close. That business, it was your parents." Miguel's expression froze, the weight of her confession settling between them like a chasm. He stared at her, his jaw tightening as he processed her words. "You're saying your family is the reason we lost everything?" "I didn't know," Clara said quickly, her voice breaking. "I swear I didn't know until today, and if I could change it, if I could undo what happened, I would." Miguel stood silent, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, as though each word was an effort. "Do you have any idea what that did to us? To my parents? To me?" Clara felt tears sting her eyes. "I do now. And I'm so sorry, Miguel. I never wanted to hurt you. I needed you to know the truth." Miguel turned away, his hands gripping the back of a chair as he struggled to contain the storm raging inside him. For so long, he had carried the pain of his family's loss, the unanswered questions about why their lives had unraveled so quickly. And now, the answers stood before him, wrapped in the very person who had come to mean so much. "I don't know what to say," Miguel admitted, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't even know what to feel." Clara stepped closer, her heart aching for the man she had come to care for so deeply. "I don't expect you to forgive me or my family. I just couldn't keep this from you, not anymore." Miguel turned to face her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hurt and something else she couldn't quite name, something that gave her a sliver of hope. "I need time," he said simply. Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Take all the time you need." As she stepped back into the rain, her chest felt both lighter and heavier. The truth was out, but the consequences were still unraveling. And as she walked away, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that her world and Miguel's would never be the same. The days after Clara's confession passed in a haze of uncertainty. She busied herself with work, philanthropy events, and social obligations. But her thoughts always drifted back to Miguel. His silence was deafening, leaving her caught in a storm of regret and hope. Clara had opened a door she couldn't close, and now she could only wait to see if Miguel would step through it or slam it shut forever. Meanwhile, Miguel grappled with his emotions. The revelation about Clara's family struck at the core of his pain, unearthing memories he had long buried. His parents' quiet despair, the empty dining table where laughter had once filled the air, and the years of struggle to hold his family together. And yet, as much as anger simmered within him, there was another truth he couldn't ignore: his feelings for Clara. On a quiet evening, Miguel found himself sitting at the kitchen table with his sister, Ana. Now a college student, she had blossomed into a determined young woman under Miguel's care. Ana had noticed his distracted demeanor over the past week and finally decided to confront him. "You've been quiet lately," Ana said, pouring herself a cup of tea. "Is something bothering you?" Miguel hesitated, then sighed. "Clara, she told me something about her family, something big." Ana leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with concern. "Big how?" "She said her father's company was responsible for what happened to us, losing the shop, everything," Miguel explained, his voice low. "I didn't know how to respond. I still don't." Ana was silent for a moment, then reached across the table to place a hand on his. "Do you believe she told you out of malice?" "No," Miguel admitted. "She seemed genuinely sorry. I could see it in her eyes." "Then maybe it's not about what her family did," Ana said gently. "Maybe it's about what she's trying to do now. People aren't defined by their pasts, Miguel. They're defined by their choices." Her words lingered long after their conversation ended. That night, Miguel sat alone, the pages of his notebook spread out in front of him. It was filled with sketches and plans, dreams for the future that had always felt out of reach. He thought about Clara, about the way she had listened to him without judgment, the way her laughter brightened even the darkest moments. He thought about the courage it must have taken for her to tell him the truth, knowing it could push him away. The next day, Clara received an unexpected text. "Can we meet?" Her heart raced as she replied with a simple yes. They agreed on a quiet cafe near the edge of the city, a place Miguel had suggested. Clara arrived early, her nerves fraying as she waited. When Miguel finally walked in, she stood, her breath catching at the sight of him. He looked tired but resolved, his usual calm tempered with something heavier. "Thank you for coming," Clara said as they sat down. Miguel nodded, studying her for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you told me, and about us." Clara's hands tightened around her cup. "I understand if you can't forgive me, or if you need more time." "I don't blame you," Miguel interrupted gently. "You weren't the one who made those decisions, but knowing what I know now, it's hard not to feel like the ground beneath us has shifted." "I feel it too," Clara admitted, "and I wish I could change the past. But what I can do is try to make things right. For you, for your family." Miguel frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I've been looking into ways to help," Clara said carefully. "Maybe by funding projects that could benefit your siblings, or rebuilding what was lost." Miguel's expression softened, but he shook his head. "I don't need you to fix my past, Clara. What I need is to understand who we are now. Can we move forward knowing what we know? Can we build something honest?" Clara's throat tightened. "I want that more than anything." They talked for hours, the conversation weaving between their hopes, fears, and the unspoken bond that had kept them tethered through the turmoil. By the time they left the cafe, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm twilight. As they stood on the sidewalk, Miguel turned to Clara. "I can't promise this will be easy," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to try, if you are." Clara nodded, her heart swelling with cautious optimism. "I am." As they parted ways, Clara felt a fragile sense of hope blooming within her. The road ahead would be uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like they were walking towards something instead of away from it. Miguel's words echoed in her mind as she drove home, a quiet reminder of the strength they would need to face whatever came next. Clara stood on the balcony of her penthouse, staring at the city lights that stretched out endlessly before her. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain, but her thoughts were miles away. For the first time, she felt the tentative threads of hope weaving through the chaos of her emotions. Miguel's willingness to rebuild their connection had brought her a fragile peace, though doubts still lingered like shadows at the edges of her mind. The next morning, Clara met with her family's legal advisor. She had spent the last few days exploring ways to make amends, not just with Miguel, but with the countless others affected by her family's ruthless business practices. "We need to create something meaningful," Clara said, her tone firm. "A foundation, a program, anything that can make a real difference for the people who've been hurt." The advisor looked at her skeptically. "This could complicate your family's financial holdings. Are you sure you want to go down this path?" Clara's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not asking for permission. Just make it happen." Her decision, though empowering, came with its own set of challenges. The idea of taking a stand against her family's legacy filled her with both determination and trepidation. Yet she knew it was the right thing to do, not just for Miguel, but for herself. Meanwhile, Miguel found himself facing an opportunity that could change his life. An old mentor from his brief time in college had reached out, offering him a position in a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting struggling communities. The job was in another city, far enough to put distance between him and the world he was beginning to build with Clara. "You'd be perfect for this," Anna said as she reviewed the email with him. "It's everything you've ever wanted." Miguel nodded, though his thoughts were tangled. The offer was a dream, a chance to create the kind of change he had always envisioned. But it also meant leaving behind the fragile connection he and Clara were working to rebuild. Later that evening, Miguel called Clara. They met at a quiet corner of the park where their paths had first truly crossed. The air was cool, and the trees rustled softly in the breeze. Clara's heart sank as she saw the hesitation in Miguel's expression. "I got a job offer," Miguel said, his tone steady but heavy. "It's everything I've wanted, working with a non-profit, helping people like my family. But it's not here." Clara's breath caught. "Where is it?" "Seattle," Miguel replied. "It's a big move, and I don't want to make promises I can't keep." Clara felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing against her. "Do you want to take it?" "I do," Miguel said, his voice tinged with regret. "But I also don't want to walk away from this, from us, without knowing what we could be." Clara stepped closer, her eyes searching his. "Then don't walk away. We'll figure it out, Miguel. If this is what you want, I'll support you." Miguel studied her, his expression softening. "You'd do that, even if it means distance." "Distance doesn't have to mean the end," Clara said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "It just means we have to work harder, and I think you're worth it." For the first time, Miguel smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "You amaze me, Clara." As they parted that night, Clara felt a strange mixture of sadness and hope. Miguel's decision loomed over them like a crossroads, but for now they had chosen to face it together. And as she walked back to her car, Clara couldn't help but feel that their story was only just beginning, even as the challenges ahead seemed insurmountable. In the weeks that followed, Clara poured herself into her plans for the foundation, while Miguel prepared for his potential move. Their lives remained intertwined, but the specter of separation cast a long shadow. Still, they both clung to the belief that their bond was strong enough to withstand whatever lay ahead. The rain came down in soft sheets as Clara stepped out of the black sedan, her coat shielding her from the chill. She glanced up at the modest office building that housed Miguel's new non-profit, a stark contrast to the opulence she was accustomed to. It had been a month since Miguel had moved to Seattle, and though they had stayed in touch through calls and messages, the physical distance between them had felt like an ocean. Miguel greeted her at the door, his expression lighting up as soon as he saw her. "You made it," he said, pulling her into a warm embrace. "Of course I did," Clara replied, smiling. "I wanted to see what you've been working on." Inside, the space was buzzing with activity. Volunteers moved between desks stacked with papers, and the faint sound of a printer hummed in the background. Miguel guided Clara through the office, explaining the programs they were developing. Initiatives for affordable housing, educational workshops, and financial literacy programs for underprivileged families. His passion was palpable, and Clara felt a swell of pride as she watched him in his element. "You're building something incredible here," Clara said as they stepped into his small office. "I can see how much this means to you." Miguel leaned against the desk, his expression softening. "It's a start, but I couldn't have done it without your encouragement." Clara hesitated, her thoughts drifting to her own efforts back home. The foundation she had started was gaining traction, though it had come at a cost. Her father had been less than pleased with her decision to use family resources for a cause he deemed unprofitable, and the tension between them had grown. Still, Clara had pushed forward, driven by a sense of purpose she had never felt before. "I've been working on something too," Clara said, pulling a small folder from her bag. "It's a proposal to collaborate with your non-profit. Scholarships, job training programs, community outreach, it's all there. I want to help." Miguel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. When he looked up, there was a mix of gratitude and something deeper in his gaze. "This is incredible, Clara, but you don't have to keep proving yourself to me." "I'm not doing it to prove anything," Clara said softly. "I'm doing it because I believe in you, in what you're building, and because I want to be a part of it." Miguel studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he set the folder down and stepped closer. "You've changed," he said, his voice low but filled with admiration. "You're not the same person I met at that gala." Clara smiled faintly. "Neither are you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world outside the small office faded away. But just as Miguel reached for her hand, the sound of raised voices broke the moment. A young man burst into the room, his face flushed with urgency. "Miguel, we have a problem. One of our major donors is pulling out." Miguel frowned, glancing at Clara apologetically before turning to the man. "I'll be right there." As Miguel followed the man out of the office, Clara watched him go, her mind racing. She had seen firsthand how precarious the non-profit world could be, how a single decision could derail even the best-laid plans. And though she believed in Miguel's ability to navigate the challenges, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was about to take another unexpected turn. Later that evening, as they walked through the quiet streets of Seattle, Miguel spoke candidly about the challenges he was facing. "It's harder than I thought it would be," he admitted, "but I'm not giving up." "You don't have to do it alone," Clara said, her voice firm. "We'll figure it out together." Miguel stopped, turning to face her. "You keep saying that. Together. But what about you? What about the life you left behind to be here?" Clara hesitated, the weight of his questions settling over her. She had spent so much time focusing on building something meaningful, on supporting Miguel's dreams, that she hadn't fully confronted her own fears. What if the sacrifices she was making weren't enough? What if, despite their best efforts, the distance, both literal and figurative, proved too great? "I don't know," Clara admitted finally. "But what I do know is that being here with you feels right, even if it's not easy." Miguel reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "I don't know what the future holds, Clara, but I do know I want you in it." As the rain began to fall again, they walked hand in hand through the city, the challenges ahead looming but their commitment to each other unwavering. They had come so far, and though the road ahead was uncertain, neither was willing to turn back. Together, they would face whatever came next. The morning sunlight filtered through the window of Miguel's small apartment, casting a warm glow over the space. Clara sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee as Miguel paced back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice was calm, but Clara could sense the tension beneath it. The non-profit had hit another roadblock. A crucial grant had fallen through, jeopardizing several of their programs. When he finally hung up, Miguel exhaled heavily and leaned against the counter. "We're going to have to scale back, at least for now." Clara set down her cup, her expression resolute. "You're not scaling back, Miguel. You're adapting, and you're not alone in this." Miguel smiled faintly, his gratitude evident. "I don't know how you keep finding ways to believe in me." "It's not hard," Clara replied softly. "You've shown me what it means to fight for something that matters." That afternoon, Clara presented Miguel with an idea she had been quietly working on, a collaborative fundraising event that would merge her foundation's resources with the non-profit's mission. "It's ambitious," she admitted, "but it could bring in the support you need, and it'll show the community what we're trying to build." Miguel studied her proposal, his skepticism giving way to cautious optimism. "You think it'll work?" "I think if anyone can make it work, it's you," Clara said confidently. The event was set for the following month, and the days leading up to it were a blur of planning, meetings, and late nights. Clara threw herself into the details, using every connection and skill at her disposal to ensure its success. Miguel, meanwhile, rallied his team, their shared determination driving them forward. On the evening of the event, the grand hall was filled with a diverse crowd, philanthropists, community leaders, and families impacted by the non-profit's work. Miguel took the stage, his presence commanding yet humble. He spoke from the heart, sharing his journey and the vision he had for the future. Clara watched from the sidelines, her chest swelling with pride as the audience hung on his every word. By the end of the night, they had surpassed their fundraising goal, securing not only the non-profit's immediate needs, but also its long-term sustainability. As the applause echoed through the room, Miguel found Clara in the crowd and pulled her into a tight embrace. "We did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "No," Clara corrected, smiling up at him. "You did it. I just helped." Later, as they walked through the quiet city streets, the weight of the evening gave way to a quiet sense of triumph. They stopped on a bridge overlooking the water, the city lights reflecting like stars on the surface below. "I've been thinking about something," Miguel said, his tone hesitant. "What is it?" Clara asked. "I want you to know how much you've changed my life," Miguel began. "Not just because of what you've done for the non-profit, but because of who you are. You make me want to be better." Clara felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "You've changed me too, Miguel. You've shown me what it means to live with purpose." He reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining as they stood in the stillness of the night. "I don't know what the future holds," Miguel said, his voice steady, "but whatever it is, I want to face it with you." Clara smiled, her heart full. Then let's do it, together. As their story unfolded under the starlit sky, a new chapter began, one filled with hope, resilience, and the unwavering belief that even the most unlikely connections could transform lives. If this story moved you as much as it did us while creating it, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let us know what you think of Miguel and Clara's journey. And if you want more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We can't wait to share more unforgettable tales with you.